Hello, everyone. So this is I really don't want this to be a longer than 25 minute video. So I'm going to try my best to keep that within this range. Actually, I'll set a timer right now too, to do that. Because Amsco kind of goes hard on this chapter. They have so much to say about Europe, and they give so many detail that would be so much more valuable in other parts like Africa or Dar es Salaam, which are very short chapters, but we'll get through this. So Europe is a region in Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, that is on the periphery in terms of like economic size or political strength. There's a lot of tiny states that are unified through one kind of like cultural institution, for the most part throughout this period. And it doesn't mean that Europe is like a backwater. I think people try to revise the story of Europe from 1200 to 1450 to say like, oh, these are just like a bunch of white people who don't know how to bathe and things like that. And that's not true. It's just like in terms of scale, they aren't comparable to China or Dar es Salaam in a lot of ways. They become more integrated in the world, and that's kind of the theme of the global tapestry. The idea of the global tapestry is that a tapestry is something that's woven. And so from 1200 to 1450, Europe becomes more interwoven with the world through the developments economically, socially, politically, and culturally. So let's get into it. We have 2 vocab pages, so pause me here. Cool. Now pause me here. So it's 21 terms. So not great. This is where you're going to be kind of shaking your fist because it's about 33 terms to memorize and there's 10 showing up on the quiz. So let's get into this. So the big kind of political theme to talk about would be feudalism. That is the primary way that Western and Central European and even some Eastern European states are organized politically. And what a feudalism is it is a series of agreements among all the different interest groups that have obligations to each other. Okay, so like a king promises things to his lord, a lord promises things to his knights. A knight does not necessarily promise things to a king unless the king and the knight have a direct vassalage relationship, and then lords and knights have obligations with peasants or workers who then have obligations who promise to do things for the knights and the lords, right? So the idea is that the monarch controls all the land, and they choose to grant land to be worked and used by a lord, and the lord will use the profits and gains to serve the interests of the crown in some general term. There's a lot of independence in this system that a lord is like given this land, they work the land, they keep a portion of it, they send some of it taxes, but the idea is that the king can allegedly take this land from a lord should they choose. Now, the amount of land a lord might get is a lot of land, and so in that case, a lord might decide to divide this land among vassals beneath him. And those would be knights in the example that Amsco gives. So a knight would have a smaller parcel of land to work or hire people to work, and that would produce goods for the lord to use, then send up to the king. And the promise and the exchange a knight would have often would be to fight for the lord in their interest. And then if the king ever called him the lord, the knights would also be helping the king indirectly by helping the lord. Okay? So lords and knights and kings also have direct control. So a king usually is directly administering some parcel of lands. And though people living on those would be peasants, and they would have to work the land, and they would expect to be protected by their lord or king or knight in the event of some kind of external threat. Okay? And this means that feudalism, defines wealth as an economic component to it. And that would be that land ownership is equivalent to wealth, right? So, and now during this time, that's a very common way of conceptualizing wealth, but as we're moving into developments in Europe and the rest of the world, there becomes other ways to become wealthy. And you think about all the ways a person can be perceived as wealthy. There are people who are millionaires who don't even probably own property, right? Because they might be renting because that's more efficient for them, right? So wealth can be different, manifest different ways, but in Europe, wealth is often defined by who owns land. So the kind of breakdown of the little divisions of land that are given and parceled out to lords and knights is the idea of a manor system. So a manor we think of like as a central building, and that would be where the lord or knight would live, and then administer the territory they control from that central building. And manors themselves were often like also villages. They were communities, and they were designed to be self-sufficient. The lord would control the mill. The lord would control like the water wheel. Often that would be used to like power the machinery, like a mill. You would have to like pay to use the lord's mill to grind your grain, and also you'd have to give some of your grain to the lord. That'd be the payment for like using their mill. And if you're a serf or a peasant, you would have no reason to ever leave, and you wouldn't be allowed to leave the manor in any way, shape, or form. Your entire social life would be defined by the manor because you couldn't leave it. So in fact, today we have these words for all the places that we live or that are around us, but actually for serfs in this period, there was only the village. They didn't have a name for it because it was the only village they ever would go to, because that's all they needed to have. They wouldn't call it Bedlam or Westminster or whatever they would call a town, because they wouldn't need to ever leave it. And one economic development that comes out of the manorial system in a way to increase the productivity of the system would be the implementation of a three-field system or a crop rotation system. And this actually is a system that develops independently in a lot of parts of the world. And Indigenous Americans use a system similar called the Three Sisters that I can't remember if America talks about, but it's this idea of every plant needs certain nutrients to be successful in their environment, even domesticated crops. And they don't all need the same kind of nutrients, or they can kind of grow differently. But if you kind of grow the same crop from the same field over a period of time, you're going to sap all of the nutrients those plants need from the soil. So if you rotate along on a three-field system, where 1 year you grow corn in one field, then the next year corn to the other field, and then the third field, and then back to the first field, what you're doing is you're giving the fields time to restore the resources needed to cultivate grain. So wheat or rye is the principal thing that was grown during this period. This would be the basis for most peasant diets and even people's diets, because it's makes bread, turns into can be ground into flour, then turned into bread, and it's a high calorie kind of thing. After you harvested your grain, you wouldn't plant grain in that field again. You would plant legumes like peas or lentils or beans, because in the process of growing and cultivating legumes, you are not taking the same nutrients out of the soil, and in fact, those plants return nutrients that are essential to the success of grains. So the growth of legumes makes the field more productive when you use it for grains in the future. And then you leave it fallow, that again allows for the passive accumulation of resources for a period of time, so that when you plant things in the year 2 years later, you are now the same kind of productivity, which leads to a massive food surplus. And this three-field system is going to lead to the people feeling more food secure, which means it's more comfortable for them making families, which means there's going to be a massive population explosion that occurs in Europe during this period. And then new technologies or better built technologies like plows or windmills using wind energy to, move things like millstones makes also production more effective as well. Oopsie, there's a blank slide there. So now we have these political trends, and this is the weirdest chapter. Weirdest thing. I really hate how they phrase this. The theme of this is that monarchs centralize their power in this period. And what I mean by that is that all of the authority and control over an area becomes consolidated in the hands of a single person. the monarch, who then distributes that power as they see fit, but also they have the capacity to take that power back if they need to. So, for example, we have the first example they give us is France. So Philip II uses a bureaucracy that fulfills tasks similar to the imperial bureaucracy, but it's not assigned. People aren't assigned that job through a civil service exam. It's either aristocratic or the favor of the king, right? He might have he might meet a person who seems to be very proficient or technical and is given a job from there, but it's really on the whim of the king. So there is some meritocratic elements to that, but often if you were an aristocrat, i.e. a landowner or a lord, you had the means to get these responsibilities and then benefit from those responsibilities. Philip IV, who comes sometime after Philip II, uses the Estates General, which is a kind of organizational body representative of commoners, nobility, and clergy, who were to advise the king, to give direction on policy proposals, and kind of what comes out of this, and this they really only talking about this in relevance to the French Revolution, so you don't need to focus on this too much, other than the king did not tax the first and second estate, which were the nobles and the clergy, and it was just a relatively weak thing. They could advise the king, but the king could just ignore them. The next example they give us is the Holy Roman Empire. And the monarch they focus on is Otto I, who claimed the role from a previous person who called himself the Holy Roman Emperor, which was Charlemagne. I mean, that was about the 800s. But the thing they kind of highlight of the increasing centralization of rulers in Europe is this lay investiture controversy, that you have land within the boundary of the Holy Roman Empire, and that is owned by the church because they were given by the church, maybe during the decline of the Roman Empire, or because a particularly pious person gave that land to them. So there's a lot of land, like in Europe, that is within the boundary of a country. Within the boundary of the country, but not necessarily directly under the control of the leader of the country, because it's owned by the church, and the church answers to a different political authority, that is the Pope. So in this world, you have a German bishop who is connected to the citizens of the people who live within this German state, this German principality, who owes an allegiance to the Pope, but is within this German place. So when he dies, who gets to decide who becomes the bishop after this guy could either be the leader of the Holy Roman Empire or the Pope, and both think they have the more legitimate claim to do so, right? So eventually, there's a concordat in this town called Worms that eventually assigned in the Holy Roman Empire. The church has the authority of assigning bishoprics. However, even though the church says that, and there are times when the church is really powerful, they assign bishops, and the Holy Roman Empire has to let that happen. There are also times when the church is weak, and the emperor can get away with assigning bishops, and even local leaders can get away with assigning bishops and ignoring the papal appointment. Right? So this conflict between politics and the church, or states and the church, is going to become a central issue to Europe in the next period when we get to the Protestant Reformation, because the church begins behaving in a way not that of its own interest beyond the interest of all of Christians. It's operating its own independent interests. The third example is Norman England, where William the Conqueror takes control of England in the 1050s. He uses the feudal system, but he assigns these people called sheriffs to govern for him, which are loyal Normans. Normandy is a part of France, just so you guys understand that. So William the Conqueror was a French dude who came and conquered England. And from that moment, England and France become linked politically through the genealogy of their monarchs. Okay, that's going to come up in the fifth thing we're going to look at in a second, or the fourth example we're going to look at in a second. But something that's distinct to English history is that after William the Conqueror's death, monarchs aren't as comprehensively strong as they might be in the Holy Roman Empire or in France. And so lords of the monarch, of the king, are able to effectively challenge and even successfully challenge the English king. This would have been King John, the guy from Robin Hood. I can't remember which number John he is. But during this challenge, the lords secure a guarantee of rights and protections in the Magna Carta. So actually, lords get a guarantee from their monarch of certain obligations, and these obligations are more favorable to the lords than they are to the monarch. And eventually this leads to the formation of the English Parliament, which is like the Estates General, but it actually has more authority and more influence than the Estates General has in France. So you have these two examples, a centralized government, more centralized government in France, where the kind of advisory body is weak, but in Britain, or England more specifically, the English Parliament has more authority than the Estates General. So from that interconnectedness, starting from William the Conqueror's conquest of England in the 1050s, you have 100 Years' War, where it is a war of succession between who should control France. England thinks they should. The French think they should. They fight a war. It's on and off for several years. It's not even 100 years, as you can see. I guess it's like 98 years. But there's a lot of periods of no conflict. There are periods of heightened activity, and there are some really famous early British victories, like Agincourt, where like the longbowmen mow down all the French knights. Don't need to worry about that at all. But eventually, the French win this war because the French are fighting in home soil. The English have to support their militaries by crossing this channel. That logistically is a nightmare. The French eventually win the war. They both use a kind of gunpowder during the conflict, but it's not really well pronounced. And what's really important is that one of the core arguments that both monarchs or both nations used was there was something that was distinctly French or something that was distinctly British to be focused on. And so what kind of becomes cogent during the 100 Years' War is the development of national identity. And then we have Muslims living also in this area, because they're in Iberia, they're in Sicily, Christians are living with Muslims. We're talking about the Jews in a second because they have a really bad time in Europe during this period. Where are we at? We have oh my God. Okay. So next thing we're going to talk about is the Roman Catholic Church. Okay. So the Roman Catholic Church is in a lot of ways the universalizing institution of Europe. Because most people, not everyone, most people are Christian in Europe. That means the church has a lot of influence on the lives of people. And in fact, because of the distribution of the church, what I was talking about when I talked about the lay investiture controversy, people probably interacted with the church more than they did with their government in a lot of different periods of what we call the Middle Ages. Okay, it says Middle Ages. Sorry, I gotta move my face. Middle Ages. So, within a state, there are hundreds of different, subdivisions that are led by, bishops or archbishops or priests. And members of the church were highly literate. So they controlled information. They also controlled the distribution of information because they also were the centers of education. So the first institutions of higher learning, universities in Europe were actually institutes of the church. So like Oxford or the Sorbonne in Paris, Sorbonne in Paris, actually started as religious institutions, which means that the church is central to the innovation and progress that occurs during the medieval period, because that's where all the learning is happening. So again, this is not a dark ages, this is a period of advancement, but the church is central to that progress. The state is in contention. You can kind of infer that from the lay investiture controversy. Monasticism. So some church-held lands were these secluded monasteries where clergy lived in relative isolation from the state. Sometimes clergy, abbeys or monasteries also controlled larger territories and villages and manors like that as well. and women became nuns. They did not have any authority, but women like would have like mother superiors who would execute or be a type of leader of a community, but that community was almost exclusively female, and they would be deferential to any kind of masculine church leader in the area. And then reform, because the clergy becomes so powerful, people join the clergy for their own personal gain, which leads to a great deal of corruption, where people are no longer, pursuing the mission as described by the church or by the Bible and things like that, which leads to people becoming more disillusioned with the church and seeking alternative interpretations of Christianity from the Roman Catholic Church. And that's going to set up set up the field and area into the Protestant Reformation that occurs next period in 1450-1750. Next, we're going to talk about our Crusades. So Christians were motivated to conquer territory from Muslims, mainly because of this concept called primogeniture. Sorry. And also just the Eastern Mediterranean area, what is modern day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, that area, is really important because that's where like the story of Jesus of Nazareth is occurring, but also like the homeland of the Jewish people. Muhammad has some moments in that part of the world too. Reportedly, he ascends to heaven and travels back to Mecca in Jerusalem as well. But going back to primogeniture, so a big issue that provides a type of boundary towards complexity in Europe during this period is the concept of gavel-kind succession, which is that when you died, your land and possessions would be divided equally among your male heirs, which meant that when you died and you were a king, your territory would be divided by the number of male children you had. So that would mean that, like, if you had 5 sons, your kingdom would be cut into fifths when you died. And that would be a problem because that means that all this centralization of power and influence and resources that had occurred during your life was reduced, into 5 different chunks and less important then. So as a consequence, to help the consolidation of land and territory, some institutions or some states begin instituting a different kind of succession law called primogeniture, which meant that only the firstborn would require all your possessions in your land, which meant that the second and third and fourth and fifth and 12th sons would get no land. And that meant that you had a lot of young men who did not have anything to live for or look forward to unless their father decided to give them anything like that. So these landless lads are kind of like angry and stuff. And so monarchs in Europe are looking for opportunities to send these landless people and landless knights who are trained in combat out of their country, stop threatening civil war, and the Crusades offer opportunities to these states. The papacy, have these cultural and also economic reasons as well. And so the First Crusade is successful. The Europeans go to Europe. They go from Europe into the Middle East. They conquer Jerusalem. They set up a kingdom of Jerusalem. As a consequence of that, Jerusalem becomes a endpoint of trade that then goes into Europe, which means that Europeans are exposed to the Eurasian trade routes, be that trans-Saharan, mostly the Silk Road, but also Indian Ocean trade coming up, eventually kind of penetrating through from the Arabian Peninsula. So European interests become exposed to Eurasian trade routes more because of the Crusades. That's the most important part of the Crusades. The Fourth Crusade also is kind of the last important crusade. There are a bunch of other crusades. Don't just ignore them. There are even crusades in Eastern Europe that UNESCO doesn't talk about. They never even get to the Middle East. They end up getting convinced to attack Constantinople, which is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which is a Christian state. And so that's like called funny and ha 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 ha. That's sad because it ends up collapsing as a consequence of that about 100, 200 years later. So now I don't have a gist on this. Oh, shoot. 1 second. Let me pause this. I know I'm running out of time. I have a minute left from what I said I was going to go. So some hallmarks of economic and social change. You have a merchant named Marco Polo, who is an Italian guy who travels along the Silk Road. He ends up in China. He describes his travels in China. He doesn't really bring much back from China, but people become aware of China and become more interested in it. So, this is a consequence also from the Crusades. Some social change. So we talked about how land was the central element of wealth. through the growth of urban centers and then development of merchant systems and a growth of a market-based economics, a new way of becoming wealthy, which is like selling things and like requiring wealth from selling things, leads to the development of a bourgeoisie or a burgher class. So these people do not own land. They are not aristocrats. They're not given their wealth by the king, which means they operate outside the purview of the king in that way. So that's going to lead to some social tensions in the future. Urban cities grow. We talked about those three field growths lead to high food supply, which leads to a bigger population because there are more people living in one place. Commerce becomes more productive because there's a bigger market to sell to instead of these larger cities. Cities also become centers of diseases because lots of people are living next to each other. And so that means the bubonic plague comes in that kills lots of people. The Little Ice Age also comes around in this period as well, which means that it's like an average a little bit colder than normal, which leads to more crop failure, which means that there's also more population stability that comes out of that. The Jews have a bad time in Europe. It grows during this period. They spread throughout Europe. They are oppressed in many ways. But they also become integral to most European states because usury, which is the idea of charging interest on loans, is seen as a sin. You only give money if you're not expected to be paid without any interest appropriated to it. Jewish people don't have those qualms, apparently. So what that means is that Jews become essential to the financial systems of Europe. And please ask your teacher in a book talk to talk about this because it's really important, because also it's the basis of a lot of anti-Semitism, but also is essential to the growth of European states in this period. But we're low on time, so I want to kind of get through these because we have one more slide of this one. There's a lot of animosity that grows between Christians and Jews, mainly on the Christian side, because Christians see these people as other. They see themselves as acquiring influence because they are perform an essential economic role within European states and communities. And so Jews are frequently, because they acquire so much wealth, targeted with violence by both the state and also by communities. Many moved to Eastern Europe and the Middle East in the Ottoman Empire. Muslims are treated pretty poorly too, but there are very few Muslims in Europe during this period of time. And then gender roles, you have a patriarchy like we have everywhere else in the world pretty much. Serfs are more equitable because men and women are doing the same kind of work, but still a female serf or peasant is still expected to do probably the farming work as well as more domestic work, while men are not seen to do that as much. However, in the middle class and aristocracy, like the bourgeoisie, gender norms are more concrete, which means that women are strictly restricted to the domestic sphere into a private sphere, and men have more access to move around how they please. So our final two slides. A Renaissance starts occurring in the 15th century, in the 1400s. Renaissance means rebirth in, I believe it's Latin. The classical texts that Arabs reserve that you learned about in 1.2 are translated back into these European languages, mainly into Latin, and then expanded upon by European thinkers, mainly thinkers in the clergy, right? So the Renaissance is starting in the clergy and then begins to expand beyond that. Something that expands beyond the purview of the clergy is this concept of humanism, which begins to focus on the human experience as opposed to the spiritual existence or the supernatural experience. So people become more interested in prescribing the human experience in a way that's different than trying to figure out how humans relate to God. There's a Southern Renaissance, that's the Italian Renaissance, that's supported by the church. An example of this would be the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. It's interesting because even though it was supported by the church, Alighieri wasn't directly supported by the church, but like the painters like Da Vinci and stuff like that were supported by the church. But Divine Comedy was not written in Latin. It called out corruption of the church, which is kind of an example of, this idea of humanism, not focusing on like the central controllers of religion and God. The Northern Renaissance is like in Northern Europe, but in England, you have an example of a thing called the Canterbury Tales, which is a series of poems just about people. When you're older, read the Baker's Tale. It's a very naughty story. And what's really interesting about Canterbury Tales is it shows the spectrum of English society. It's not written in Latin. It is written in Middle English, which is a very fun little language to learn. Russia happens. There's not much to talk about this. We'll talk about it more with Unit 2. Just that the origins of Russia begin here. The Kievan Rus came before. The Kievan Rus are conquered by the Mongols. The Mongols use local nobility to govern the area because Russia is so remote. These local nobles become stronger, and then they revolt against the Mongols, and they're successful. That's Russia. And that's it. I did it in 30 minutes. I'm sorry this is so long, guys, but it's a long chapter. So, put me on a little bit slower because I know I was going fast at the end. And I will see a good number of you in my class, and I hope this helped you guys all. Bye. Oh, bye.